Oh. Good morning.
Yeah, I've heard.
Closer, even closer? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today on this beautiful Saturday morning. I can't get over how nice the weather is right now, especially after the bizarre hailstorms we were having the other week. First off, my name is Catherine Dietzman. I'm part of Friends of the San Juans. I'm their shoreline and mapping specialist, and really excited to introduce you to our other speakers here today and partners that have been working with us to put this workshop on. So we've got Tina Whitman from Friends of the San Juans as well. And then we have Tracy Sanderson and Jessica Cote from Blue Coast Engineering, based out of the mainland. And then we also have the Northwest Straits Foundation here with us, Ellen Gowdy and Haley Sherman back there. And then a couple of staff members from Friends of the San Juan, Isabel Alexander, our newest inclusion on our team. And then we have our executive director, Eva Schulte today, and our board member, Joe Cohen. Thanks for coming. Yeah, so Friends of the San Juans is an organization that protects shorelines for people and nature. So we're really pleased to be doing this today and excited for what's to come. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We'll be here for a little while for the indoor portion of the workshop. We'll have some presentations, and then we'll take about a 10-minute or so break and head over to the East Sound Waterfront Park to do our field trip portion. Also, just to note, the bathrooms, I'm sure many of you are aware, are just out to the right. Out these doors to the right, and then coffee, tea, pastries, so help yourself, and we're around for questions too, so should be really fun. So thanks so much. I'll pass it off to Tina now.
Good morning. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Tina Whitman. I know lots of you in the room. I live here on Orcas. And I am gonna talk about, do sort of the 30,000 foot level that's before. One second. Do you think this will work now? Awesome. Do sort of the 30,000 foot level of kind of just grounding us all of what we're going to talk about today, right? Why the shorelines of the San Juans are so special, why they're such an important part of our community for people and our marine ecology. And then we'll turn it over to Jessica and Tracy to really get into the nuts and bolts, which I bet you're mostly here for, of sort of the practical things of how our shorelines are functioning and processing, and what's happening on them, and things that you can do to help your property into the future. So I'll get started with that. This is I love this photo. It's a little rhinoceros auklet with a mouthful of Pacific sand lance. One of our closest sand lance spawning sites is right over at Crescent Beach. And just a bit on Friends of the San Juans. Most of you, if you've been on the islands, have heard of us. We've been around since 1979. We were formed by a group of forward-thinking islanders who formed the community-based nonprofit to support San Juan County in its very first efforts to have land use planning. So we decided to treat forest and ag and shorelines differently, to not have, you know, any kind of parcel size that you wanted, to have some zoning. So that's kind of our base. Our history is in land use. We do much more. We work kind of at that intersection of science and policy and education. And we have 3 program areas: healthy Salish sea, natural shorelines, and thriving communities. And today we're really kind of focused on that natural shorelines component. So we all know this, right? We're a community of islands, something like 400 islands at low tide. We're made up of shorelines, and 400 sounds like a lot, right? That's a big number. But I don't think we ever really, like, until I really put this out, I did this exercise for myself and thought, That's a really long way. If you were driving 400 miles, you would drive from Eugene, Oregon to Vancouver, British Columbia. That is a lot of shoreline packed into a little county, right? And that is such an important part of what makes our community what it is for all of us, humans and the marine environment. It's also really important to, when we're thinking about the marine environment and also the San Juans, to recognize, right, that the San Juan Islands have an extensive and rich history of tribal presence, use, and management that continues today. And then some more about, we like to say in our office that we're at the heart of the Salish Sea. So we really think about, you know, we all kind of get focused on our property or our island or our county, but we're really part of a bigger ecosystem, right? We're part of the larger Salish Sea. But we've got all that packed in shoreline, right? You can see all these large open expanses of deeper water that's not frankly as productive, right? That land sea interface is a really productive part of our shorelines. We also have really diverse geology. Folks will know that, right? Some people have a low bank, you know, really muddy, sandy, silty. Some people are on bedrock. So it's very diverse geologically, and then that drives really diverse habitat types. We also have a lot of different parcels, right? It's all kind of chunked up into smaller pieces. There's over 5,000 shoreline parcels, and over 90% of those are owned privately and are mostly in residential development, right? So all of us that are, I am actually not a shoreline property owner, but many of you are, and folks that are shoreline property owners have a really important role to play. And I think it's also really important, you can see in our county that's more water than land, right? Even if you're not a waterfront property owner, everything that happens in our watersheds, everything we do in our community affects our marine environment. So in a way, we're kind of all waterfront owners, right, in an island community. And we also are home to iconic and imperiled species. We've got our southern resident orca, our salmon, our seabirds, our rockfish, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of these species as we go along. So our shorelines are also kind of the foundation of our economy, right? Our second home economy, our tourism economy, sort of why, you know, people are fishing and we're out looking at the whales and viewing the wildlife. Folks that live here and that are visiting here, it's a really, the shorelines are really, it's just sort of part of who we are, right, as the islands. And a really important part of marine food webs. So the ecology, all that shoreline habitat where we have we're supporting the little feeder fish that are then supporting the birds, that are supporting the salmon, supporting the lingcod, supporting directly the marine mammals like the minke there on the left, also supporting through the salmon, our southern resident killer whales. One of the things I like to tell too is just sort of an example of how the shorelines and the San Juans are helping kind of feed the regional marine ecosystem, that larger Salish Sea, right? Why our little shorelines actually matter even at that regional level. And a part of that story is a good example is the little marbled murrelet. So that little seabird nests in old growth forests, not in the San Juans. They nest on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They nest in Olympic National Park. And in the summer, they fly to the San Juans to pick up a fish and fly back to their nest to feed their baby. So we're playing a really important role in the regional ecosystem. If people have heard of the marine blob, the heat waves that are happening, and there's not mixing happening on the outer coast sometimes, it's been affecting Oregon and the outer coast of Washington. We'll see drops in the fish populations out there during those times because the nutrients from the bottom aren't coming up when the water's not mixing. Seabirds that nest on the outer coast, different species as well, are also flying daily to the San Juans to get a mouthful of fish and go back to this. So we're really, again, playing an important role in the regional ecosystem because of all that shoreline we have. And then this again, Tracy will talk a little more about these habitats and their roles and where they are. And I'm sort of more just kind of setting the stage. So this is our beautiful bull kelp. This is photo taken by one of my coworkers. Those are Pacific herring. It's off the west side of San Juan Island. This is our canopy kelp, the one you see when you're out boating. We also have many, many species of understory kelp. Our eelgrass habitats. This is at low tide, but again, it's providing structure. It's kind of part of the marine food web, also help holding that sediment together. It has rhizomes that are really helping keep the sand in place. Our beach habitats, we have many species, and I'm gonna get to them in a second, but we have species of fish that actually come and spawn, and they come way up at the high tide line when the tides are high, right? And incubate their eggs up on our beaches, so that's an important part of the marine food web. And also all the insects, and you know, if you've ever walked along a beach where there's a lot of seaweed, right, and kicked it over, there's a lot of bugs in there. Baby salmon are eating those bugs and other fish. And some of these fish that are a key part of the marine food web, and many of you in the room probably know, a lot of us have heard of Pacific herring. We might fish with them. They're commercially important. They spawn just offshore on eelgrass and kelps. And a great example is right downtown East Sound, right around Indian Island, and also on the Crescent Beach side is one of 4 remaining herring spawning areas in the San Juans. So we have right in our backyard herring spawn. And then the beach spawners, the sand lance and the surf smelt. Those are the fish that come up and lay their eggs actually on the beach. And so they're really, it's so amazing to like stand with a shoreline property owner, right, and find eggs on their beach. You're standing, you know, up under the trees, and you're providing fish habitat, right? That's part of the marine ecosystem. And then I throw northern anchovy in, they're an important fish for our marine food webs. They don't spawn in the near shore, but the other 3 rely on shallow water or beach habitat for spawning. And that's part of why our beaches are so important to the marine food web. So there's kind of a lot going on in this, but this is sort of showing the picture of baby salmon, right? So we have one spawning stream in the San Juans, and that's on Orcas and Cascade Creek. That's a salmon spawning stream. And we also have you know, coastal cutthroat trout, which are salmonid. But when you're thinking about kind of your traditional salmon, and this is looking at Chinook salmon. So even though we don't have those large rivers and we don't have a lot of spawning habitat for salmon, we have rearing habitat for salmon. And so this is showing the different colors or the different watersheds that baby Chinook salmon, so I'm talking little ones like 3, 4, or 5 inches long, coming through right now. They come through basically March through September, depending on the stock and the run and where they're coming from. So the different colors are all the different watersheds where fish from those watersheds have been documented rearing as juveniles in the San Juans. And then the thickness is the proportion of those fish that are rearing in the San Juan. So you can see those Fraser River fish make up 40% of the salmon that are coming through the San Juans. But we even have, so this is done on genetic work, there's even fish that were born on the west side of Vancouver Island in the stream coming in here to use this rich and productive rearing habitat. There was a study done by NOAA Fisheries that showed they were looking at growth hormones that showed that a baby salmon who's getting bigger in the San Juans versus getting bigger on the stretch of Whidbey or down here or up in Bellingham is actually getting more fish and getting bigger faster, right? And if you're a fish, getting bigger faster is all about survival and increasing your odds. You can imagine those arrows going the opposite way in a couple of years, right? And we've got those adult Chinook salmon coming back, and that's what's supporting our southern resident killer whale. And that's why historically those huge Fraser River runs are why we would always see the salmon or the orca on the west side of San Juan Island, following those Fraser River runs. So we've got threats to our shorelines too, right? So and we forget about it here in the San Juans, unless you live on the north or east side of Orcas. Actually, some folks from Orcas have a much better sense, right, of what's going on, just like folks on the west side of San Juan Island. We are in the midst of international shipping lanes. The Port of Vancouver is the largest port in Canada. And then also Port of Tacoma, Port of Seattle. So the risk of these, right? What is the risk to shorelines? It's really the oil spill risk, right? A catastrophic oil spill that would be sort of game over for people and nature around here and our economy. And then also there's noise impacts to marine mammals and other things. Boating destination. This photo is Susha Island, Mother's Day, and the pandemic when everyone went out and bought a boat. So we're obviously an international boating destination, and you can have really low impact boating, but also there can be impacts to shorelines, especially eelgrass habitat from boating, say like from anchoring. Climate change, right? Things are changing. We're seeing differences in the way that rainfall, if you're a waterfront property owner, you're probably experiencing some of these differences. We're having really intense rains. Some of our king tides can be extreme with some of the storms or the rain, and also sea levels are rising. We're lucky in this part of the world that they're rising slower, but they are still rising. This is actually Blind Bay over on Shaw. And shoreline development, right? Just like this intersection of land and sea is where a lot of the marine ecology wants to be focused. It's where humans are around the world, right? Like we all love the beach, is my favorite place to be. And that's where we put a lot of our infrastructure. That's where we're doing our development. And there are various, there's lots of old weird stuff out there that's unnecessary. And that's a part of what we do at Friends is restoration projects, is identifying sort of where is there a derelict or unnecessary structure, right, that would be really easy to take out. And there's also a lot of better designs for structures these days, right? The old days docks were really wide and it was fully planked and there was no light getting through. Now they have all that like high-tech grading and, you can do all these things that you couldn't do before to really reduce your impacts with your structures. And I'm going to stop there and we'll do maybe just a couple of questions. If anyone has questions kind of on, again, I'm kind of just setting the stage and we're really going to turn into the more detail with Jessica and Tracy. Questions? Sandy.
Why is sea level rise different here than other parts of the ocean?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is that it depends a little just bit in terms of where you are, geographically, in terms of latitude, longitude, things like that, in terms of the oceans and the open oceans and the global currents. The other thing is, though, here we were formed, our geology and the shape of Puget Sound and the Salish Sea were formed by glaciers. And so the glaciers had a lot of weight to them and they were pressing down on the land. So in many places in the Salish Sea, the land is still what we call rebounding. So it's coming back from that glaciation period. And so it's actually uplifting at the same time as the seas are rising. So we don't see the rising of the sea level isn't affecting us as much because the land is also going up, but not at the same rate. Seas are still rising faster than the land is rebounding.
Good question. All right, I think we're turning it over. Tracy, yeah. Great. Oh,
No.
Sorry.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Haley Sherman. I'm the project coordinator for the Northwest Straits Foundation. I'm just here to give you a little bit of an introduction to our organization and the programs we run. One of my main roles at the foundation is to connect shoreline landowners to our shore-friendly program, so we can provide you with the tools and resources so that you can protect your properties as well as the marine environment. The mission at the Northwest Straits Foundation is to protect and restore the marine resources of the Northwest Straits region. And so the Northwest Straits region encompasses the northern region of the Puget Sound. There are 7 counties that includes: Whatcom County, Skagit County, Snohomish County, Island County, Jefferson, Clallam, and San Juan County. And so this workshop is a part of our shore friendly program, but we run a number of other programs. We run the Nearshore Restoration Program. Up there, you can see the 2 left photos. We run our derelict gear program where we remove derelict crab pots and fishing nets. And we have a citizen science monitoring program as well. And so the shore friendly program, we provide these workshops. They're a great educational resource for shoreline landowners, and the issues covered in this workshop are really pertinent to our mission, because we want to protect and restore these resources, but we also need to understand that conditions on the shoreline are changing due to climate change and sea level rise. And so those affect the kind of decisions that we need to make and we need to make every day, because nearly 70% of our shorelines are privately owned. And our role is to provide you the best science-based information to help you protect your investments as well as the marine environment. And a great way we also do that is provide you with a free technical site visit with our consultants here, like Jessica and Tracy. And they can look at your geology, your vegetation, your drainage, and give you great recommendations on how to improve those. And we actually, at the Shore Friendly program, offer cost share opportunities as well if you choose to implement those. So that's a great resource. And Shore Friendly is a region-wide program. So there's a Shore Friendly pretty much that covers all the way down to Thurston County or equivalent. We are grant funded by the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program. Here in the San Juans, your Shore Friendly partner is the Friends of the San Juans. So if you are interested in a technical site visit, contact Tina or Catherine. And Catherine will go into greater detail about the resources they provide later. So that's all I have today, and I will pass it on.
I'm gonna introduce myself real quick and then Tracy's gonna get us started, but before I do, you all have in your packets something called a key point handout. And so that has sort of a summarizing point or two about every slide essentially that we're gonna have up here. So you don't have to take copious notes. There is room for notes on there, or if you have questions and you want to write them down so that you don't forget them, we will pause at the end of our technical presentation to take questions. We're gonna ask you a couple questions along the way. But I'm Jessica Cote, so I am a coastal engineer. I have a master's degree in coastal and ocean engineering from Oregon State University, and I've been practicing for about 25 years, give or take. And locally in the Puget Sound region for almost 20 years. Some people also consider me a coastal geomorphologist because I really am a softer type of engineer. I focus on restoration. I'm one of the owners of the company, and the coastal geomorphology just is the intersection between understanding coastal processes, how they interact with the geology to form our shorelines. And I'm going to pass it to Tracy to get us started.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name's Tracy Sanderson. So I am an ecologist with Blue Coast Engineering. That means I study animals and the habitats they live in. And I've got about 20 years of experience and a master's degree from Evergreen State College. And I'm certified as a professional wetland scientist and fisheries professional. I'm going to start off just going over an overview of what we're all both going to talk about. I'm going to start off talking about nearshore habitats, expanding just a little bit on what Tina started off with, talking about eelgrass and kelp and salmon and forage fish. And then I'll also cover shore types and then hand off to Jessica, and she's going to talk about forces on the shoreline, including water levels, wind waves, wakes, and tidal currents. And then she's going to talk about the forces in relation to the shoreline change that those forces create, including changes to the beach profile, as well as sediment movement along the shore. And then we'll finish off talking about human modifications on the shoreline, expanding on the hard armoring that Tina touched on at the start, as well as soft shore protection, managed retreat, which you might have heard of, and then I'll finish off talking about drainage management and vegetation management. So to start off with, I'm going to expand a little bit on what we mean when we're talking about the nearshore, to give you guys an idea of that land-sea connection that Tina mentioned in her intro. So when we're talking about the nearshore, we're talking about anything from the extent of the photic zone. So that's the extent in the water to where sunlight can penetrate and most of the vegetation will be growing offshore, all the way up inland to approximately 100 or 200 feet inland where the vegetation is growing along the shoreline. And in a natural system, this area is a really highly connected area where there's energy in the form of nutrients and other stuff going back and forth across that land-sea connection. And I'll just use some bubbles here to circle areas and highlight just a few of those connections. So for example, on a bluff, you'll have sediment or trees and other vegetation that slides down, and that's the source material for the beach in front of the bluff, as well as along the beach, downdrift from that location. And Jessica will talk a little bit more about what I mean by downdrift later. And then that sediment can accumulate in the upper beach. You'll find the place we're going to for our field trip is a really good example of wood accumulating in that upper shore. And then you'll see when the wood accumulates, that can give places for vegetation to establish, as well as for sediment to accumulate. And unfortunately, it's also a good example of where your trash can accumulate as well. There was a lot of trash on the beach when we were out this morning checking out the site. And then marine riparian vegetation. So that's just the vegetation that grows along the shoreline. And riparian just means it's next to water. That serves a really important ecological role, as well as it's important for water quality. The vegetation can filter the water, remove contaminants and excess nutrients. Terrestrial insects can live in those plants and then fall into the water and be sources of food for the fish. Sorry, the microphone is really distracting. And then also it provides shade on the shoreline. So those forage fish that are spawning in the upper intertidal, when they're fish eggs, it's gonna drive me nuts. Sorry, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. I can't. Okay, so some of the important things about marine riparian vegetation I covered, and then vegetation that's offshore. So that eelgrass and kelp is so important in the intertidal area. It gives a three-dimensional structure for a lot of different animals to live in, as well as providing habitat for those animals to be prey to other things such as sea lions, seals, all that sort of stuff. And then that material can die and it drives the bottom of the food web. So we call it the detritus food web. It's either being eaten by small plankton and crabs and different stuff in the offshore, but there's also critters, insects on the near shore that are eating that detritus as well. That upper intertidal sometimes doesn't look like there's a lot of stuff going on, but if you kick the rack that's there, you'll find all sorts of insects pop up, and that's where those forage fish are spawning. So a really important habitat as well. Then small stream mouths, or what we would call pocket estuaries or barrier embayments, smaller, quieter water along the shoreline is really important for those juvenile salmonids, as well as other fish to have a nice rearing habitat. And it varies a lot between species, but the threatened Chinook is known, it's very clearly studied that it leaves its natal stream, so the river that it was born in, and it will go to these quiet waters and rear to get big, like Tina was talking about, so that it can then go out to the open ocean, get even bigger, and then come back to spawn. So really important habitat. So yeah, the salmon come back and spawn, and when they do, they're bringing nutrients back to those natal rivers where they came from, and that's allowing those trees in the marine riparian area to grow bigger. And Chinook salmon are the primary food for southern resident killer whales. So healthy shorelines support forage fish, support salmon, support the orcas, and that's just super simplified. There's lots of other connections that are going on. Eelgrass and kelp, really important in the intertidal area. Eelgrass is actually a flowering plant. Many people don't know that. You might think it's algae. It does a lot of roles in that kind of mean lower low water area. It is a flowering plant, so it gathers up nutrients, including carbon that's in the water. So it's actually a source of carbon sequestration within the aquatic environment, an important habitat. It also has those rhizomes that Tina mentioned and can help stabilize the sediment that it's growing in. And even during the winter, when it tends to die back a little bit, those rhizomes are still underneath there and will come back the next year and can stabilize the sediment over the winter. Kelp is a type of brown algae. This is bull kelp. There's also a lot of other types of kelp that are smaller understory. And then on the open coast, we also have a variety of like giant kelp and other kelp that are larger canopy cover type kelps as well. Salmonids, Tina touched on the fact that there's, different species of salmon and trout. We have 8 different species that exhibit some sort of anadromous life cycle, meaning that they start in fresh water. That's where they're born. They go out to the open ocean to get big. They come back in and they spawn again. Not all species die when they come in to spawn, but a lot of ours do. And that's important when you think about living on the shoreline, because the salmon and trout are going to need a healthy habitat all along the way of that life cycle to be able to make it back and successfully spawn again. And when they can't make it back to successfully spawn again, that's when populations go down. Forage fish, we'll talk a lot about them because they're the ones that are spawning in that upper intertidal where shoreline property owners live. The sand lance and the surf smelt are those upper intertidal spawners. And the herring that Tina mentioned are the ones that are spawning a little bit farther offshore on the kelp or eelgrass or other submerged aquatic vegetation. Department of Fish and Wildlife has a website you can go to, look up your property and see if there's ever been a survey there, see if there's been documented spawning there. The beach we're going to today doesn't have documented spawning, but we'll be able to point out other ones in the area that do have documented spawning. And that's something in the San Juans that's actually done through citizen science, and Friends of San Juans has groups that go out and do monitoring for forage fish jointly with DFW. So providing the information to DFW to go on their website. And they also, Friends also has additional information on forage fish spawning habitats and threats to forage fish spawning on their website. This diagram just shows the area on the beach where the surf smelt and sand lance and herring spawn. So you can see on the upper left that shows drift logs. So that's commonly the place where if there's going to be shoreline armoring on the property, that's where it's going to be. So that armoring can literally cover the habitat. So just physically removing that as a zone where the fish can spawn. It can also change the substrate. So the rock size by reflecting wave energy off of the structure, which tends to make the material coarser in front of the structure, making it not suitable for the surf smelt or sand lance because they need a mix of sand and gravel. And we'll be able to, even though they don't spawn on the beach, we're going to for the beach walk, we can give you an idea of what sort of substrate would look like that's suitable for surf smelt and sand lance to spawn in. Now I'll talk about coastal landforms. There's many different types of landforms. You could have a really artificial modified one. You could live on a beach. You could live on a bluff. You could live on a, on the backside of an estuary. You could live on a spit. And these forms are all driven by underlying geology, which we're not going to talk a whole lot about today. But then we will talk about the forces that work on the shoreline that create these different landforms. And in the San Juans, you primarily have rocky shorelines, which are exposed bedrock. You're kind of lucky if you live on this type of shoreline because you're probably not at much risk for any sort of erosion on your property because it takes a long time to erode the bedrock. And then pocket beaches are an area of where there is softer geologic material in between two rocky headlands, and that's eroded back and forms a crescent shaped beach in between the two rocky headlands. And this pocket beaches are also an area really important for juvenile salmon as they're making their way out to the open ocean. And then beaches and bluffs. Broad category, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next few slides of how we categorize them as like low, medium, or high in terms of the bluff. So in a low no bank, that's something, if you live on that sort of beach, you can think of that as something where it's like less than 5 feet of a bluff. You could, depending, if you don't have any physical, ailments preventing you from, you should generally be able to just walk down to the beach without needing like stairs or anything like that to get down. On a natural beach, natural low bank beach, it would be dependent on sediment from other areas, so bluffs updrift of the location that you're at. And naturally, wood and vegetation is going to accumulate in that upper beach area and stabilize the upper portion of the beach. This is a common shore type where we would have armoring, and the armoring is usually placed with the intent of creating a hard structure that you can then fill behind, creating a flat space to build a house or other structure. And the armoring is not really designed to prevent from sea flooding, because you can imagine if water is coming in from the ocean side, as soon as it gets to any elevation above the elevation of that structure, the water from the sea is going to be able to flow onto the property. And then it's not really designed to allow that water to come back out. And so that seawater can actually stay longer on your upland property, creating more issues before it has the chance to fully drain out. Medium bank, something, and these are not any sort of strict, like, there's not an engineering manual that says a medium bank is XYZ, but it's something between 5 and 20 feet. You would need some sort of stairs or, rope swing or something to be able to get down to the beach. Or you're just very good at climbing bluffs. On a natural beach, similar, if the bluff has already started to move back a bit, you are going to get an accumulation of anything that's come down from that bluff at the toe of the bluff that will protect that area from erosion due to wave energy. And then again, you may find armoring on these types of shorelines, but if the armoring is not going up to the height of the bluff, or bank, you can have continued erosion above the elevation of that structure, because there's also erosion, and Jessica will talk more about this, that's caused from upland processes such as drainage and lack of vegetation. And then we tend to say that a high bank or bluff is anything above that 20 feet, and you definitely would need some sort of substantial structure to get down to the beach. Once you get to these sorts of heights, you can have larger landslide sloughing events that can pose more risk to any of the structures that you have on top of the bluff. And I guess I should say, there are in cases in Puget Sound where we have put structures at the bottom of a high bank or bluff. It's probably not the best location for a home. But with that, I think we're going to go and just do a quick check-in with people. And we were curious to know how many people in the room have a low no bank sort of property. Just a couple. And then medium. Okay. And are there any people on high bluffs? Okay. Just to engage.
You're in between? In between the high bank and the.
Okay, that's okay. Okay, great. And I assume you can all hear me. Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about water levels, but I'm gonna talk about the forces that act on that geology and really create these shore forms that Tracy was mentioning. You're all familiar with tides. If you live on an island, I'm sure you're familiar with tides. We have too high and too low a day in this region. Those are what we call static water levels. So they're predictable. It's the sun and the moon and the earth, those forces, but we can predict those reasonably well on a daily basis. The water levels and the tides also affect the regulatory boundaries. So one of the regulatory boundaries in terms of things where you would need a permit is called the high tide line. And it's about where a king tide would fall on your shoreline roughly, but it's something we can calculate. The high tide line is the regulatory boundary for the Army Corps of Engineers. So you need a permit from a federal permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, National Marine Fisheries, if you do work below that high tide line. This is showing where these water levels fall on a natural beach, so with no structures on it. So that high tide line is usually at the upper extent of where wood can wash up to roughly. Mean high or high water is at a slope break. We have a lot of vegetation and wood above the mean high or high water. Another regulatory boundary is the ordinary high water mark. It's not a calculated number. It's done based on vegetation demarcations and wood. And that's the county and the state boundary. Anything within 200 feet of that line or below it, you need local and state permits in order to do any kind of project or work. Mean tide level and then the low tide terrace down below. If we look at these water levels where there's a shoreline structure, typically that king tide, high tide line is going to be on the face of the structure. Sometimes it's over the top. If it's a really old structure, was built a long time ago when water levels were a little bit lower. The structure is going to be close to the mean high or high water elevation. We have our upper beach in between. And then the other same tidal datums that I mentioned there. You know, the type of sediment on your beach is different everywhere in Puget Sound. Again, we're geologically or glacially formed. So when the different glaciers came in, they had different types of material with them. So some places might have deposited a lot of sand. Other places there might be larger cobble and gravel. So just really variable because of that glacial history in Puget Sound. We mentioned a little bit about this. Sea levels are rising. It's been documented that they're rising. There's a tool that was developed by the University of Washington to go and you can select a particular portion of shoreline. So the blue highlighted areas is where this particular graph is representative of. So there's more than one graph, even within, you know, the San Juan Islands. The orange line is showing what we call a high emissions scenario, essentially, right? So how fast sea levels are rising is really dependent on how much greenhouse gases we're emitting globally. So if we're going to continue emitting at the same rates or higher, then it would follow the orange line and trend sea level rise. If it was a lower emissions rate scenario, it would be the blue. So about half a foot by 2050, that's not that far off. And then there's a bigger range, again, based on that emission scenario when we look out further. So sea levels could be 1.5 to 2 feet by 2100. These graphs take into account what I was mentioning before about that, it's called tectonic uplift or that rebounding. So if the land is actually moving upwards, so this is a relative sea level rise, really for that local area. So sea levels are rising, we have static tides, and then on top of that, we have some additional forces that cause what we call a total water level. So as engineers, if you come to us and say, you know, our shoreline's been fine for the last 20 years, but all of a sudden, you know, December 2022, we saw this massive erosion event. And then we would say, well, December 27, 2022, we had a lot of people say, well, we had a king tide event. Well, it was more than a king tide event. It was a king tide. We also had a low pressure system. And so low pressure pushes down in the middle of the water, which raises the water on the shorelines. And then in a lot of places, you also were exposed to wind and wind waves on top of that. So there can be multiple things on top of each other. So we call that an extreme water level. It's not just tides, it's multiple forces creating that. So this is just showing if you add storm surge is what it's called, all those things wrapped up together, the wind waves, the atmospheric effects on top of our current sea levels or our predicted sea levels, we're going to start to overtop a lot of our infrastructure that was built a long time ago. Here's an example. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this road. Was this taken in December 2022, Tina?
No, this was, I think, 2016.
Yeah. Okay. And so, all that wood, right, washing up. So a lot of our roads, especially, and there are examples actually where roads have been moved inland, and we are working on it from a long range planning perspective. It's gonna be hard, but it's just something that's gonna have to happen because they're just not gonna last. And then this is American Camp, so structures, again, that were built a long time ago on land that was high and dry. That land is no longer high and dry. And that is because of these extreme water levels. I should also mention that December 2022 event, that's like less than 1% chance that all of those particular extreme events would have happened at the same time in terms of the king tide and those extreme storms. And I think a lot of people were really nervous about the 2023, 2024 winter, and we haven't seen those kind of extreme events this year. So they're not, but it also gave us a lens and a look into the future with sea level rising that we can expect to see that more often. So wind waves are the primary force on our shoreline that move sediment, that change our beaches and shape our beaches. And it's dependent on the speed of the wind that's blowing across the water, the length of time that it blows continuously. So not just like a gust and then nothing for a while, but it has to blow fairly continuously to build the waves. Fetch is the distance at which it blows. So I think Tina mentioned, if you're out on the western shorelines or the northern shorelines, you might have a very long fetch across one of the major straits. But if you're on the interior of the islands, you probably have a much shorter fetch. And so the waves can't get as big if they don't have as long of a distance for that wind to blow. Water depth is also a really important factor that a lot of people don't consider as much. In Puget Sound, we have our waves are what we call depth limited, which means that it's not infinitely deep like it is in the open ocean. And so the waves can only get so big before they essentially break because they start to feel the bottom and interact with the bottom and they lose energy. So water depth is also important. And then orientation, if you're standing on the shoreline and you want to know what your wind waves are on the shoreline, the orientation of your shoreline relative to the dominant wind direction is really important. So in the Salish Sea, if you were in southern Puget Sound, the winds would come from the west and then come up the sound. So winds are topographically steered. They come through the Straits of Juan and split. They go south and then they come north through the San Juan. So you're getting wind waves out of the south, hitting the southern portion of the San Juan Islands. And then you get winds out of the Straits of Georgia from the north. The strongest winds in the region are out of the south. That is just the global pattern. So we tend to get the most energetic winds and wind waves if you're southerly exposed. Not that you don't get wind waves if you're northerly exposed, they just tend to be not quite as severe. So vessel weights also move sediment. I'm really not going to talk about them a lot today, except to mention that yes, they do. It has a lot of variability in the type of boat. Predominantly, we see effects from vessels in very narrow passageways. Tidal currents also move sediment. They tend to not be as strong as wind waves in Puget Sound. Typically, wind waves win out in Puget Sound in terms of being the dominant transport mechanism. If you're on a headland or right on a point, you might have more effects from tidal currents than other locations. So all these forces that are moving sediment, that are causing erosion, they're not bad. Although I think sometimes, as property owners, I'm sure you feel like you're fighting them, and they feel evil. Erosion has kind of gotten this dirty word. And it is scary. And certainly if your home is close to the shoreline, but it is a natural process. And if we weren't living on the shoreline, right, it wouldn't be an issue. Or if we didn't have ports and harbors and all those other things that we need on the shoreline, then they would just go about their day and, so be it. But that's not the case. But it's important because it does deposit sediment on the beaches. And what happens in one location affects lots of other portions of the shoreline in terms of sediment and sediment supply. So beaches change seasonally and also over very long periods of time. So you might look at your beach in the wintertime, it looks very different than it does in the summer. You might look at it one year and it looks very different than it did 3 or 4 years before. So this is just showing an example of a photo taken of a beach in February on the upper image, where the material is a little bit coarser, the sediment is a little bit lower, there's no dew grass growing, or it's died. And then in August, down below, there's more sand on the upper beach, there's more vegetation growing. So this is pretty typical of our beaches in terms of a winter, summer type of profile. But I've also seen beaches where you have sand one year and you have no sand the next year too, you know, so they're highly variable in Puget Sound. And I'll talk in a minute about ways that you can document those changes on your shoreline that can be really informative if you have concerns, if you're asking for a technical site visit, it can give you some history. We're just going to show a little animation. There you go. So as I mentioned, so the wind blows across the water. When it hits the shoreline, it tends to move sediment along shore if it hits at an oblique angle. And so that along shore movement can take material that comes from bluffs, for example, and it will feed beaches at the other end of where it's moving to. I'm going to talk about the extensive movement in a minute, but so yes, the erosion comes down from, or erosion of the bluff deposits sediment on the beach that moves along shore. It can form things like sand spits, or it just nourishes the beach itself. How about? Great, thanks. Yeah, great, yeah. So large structures like this block sediment, but another thing that they do is they actually help us tell which direction sediment's moving. So you might have something on your beach where sediment's accumulating on one side and the beach is lower on the other side. Well, in this picture, the material is moving from below at the bottom of the screen to the north, because you can see how much wider the beach is on this side of the pier than on the other side of the pier. This is actually a project where they're going in and removing all that understory structure and creating more space so that the sediment will actually be able to move through it better and not creating, because it's essentially starving the beach on the downdrift side of it is the problem, you know. The one beach sacrifices. But smaller residential structures, as I mentioned, so they can have that same effect. But they also are an indicator you can tell which way material is moving. Now, this is a net movement over, like, you know, averaged over a long period of time. You definitely might see it go one way, especially if you're in a pocket beach. They often have reversals, right? It'll go one way during one season and just go the other way during the other season and kind of stay between those two rocky headlands. So those larger areas in which material moves, we call those littoral drift cells. And you can call them just drift cells. That's easier. There's mapping of these on Department of Ecology, Coastal Atlas. Friends has also, you know, looked at these in QAQC to make sure that they're right. Again, large on average. One of the reasons that drift cells are important, though, is it's, again, that interconnectedness. So something that happens, you know, in the upper portion of a drift cell would affect the downdrift beaches, right? So hard armoring of a feeder bluff that can't actually deposit sediment to the beach anymore. So when you look at this, it's standing, if you're looking at the shoreline is the way they orient it, and the green means the sediment's moving from the left to the right. So that means because we have southwest winds coming at an oblique angle, hitting that shoreline, driving sediment to the right in this case. The red means no appreciable drift, it just means there's not a lot of sediment moving around there. I think pocket beaches are designated pocket beaches, but they're also designated no appreciable drift because essentially you're not losing material one way or another, it's just kind of staying in that general vicinity. Here's another example of where you see two drift cells converging. So when you have a point, a sandy point like this Spencer Spit is exposed to southerly winds from the south and northerly winds to the north. To enough of an extent that it actually moves material from both sides and they converge and deposit here. And then even within a bay, a lot of times you do have material that can continue moving around the bay. It doesn't just kind of go up in and stop necessarily. Again, this is mapped for every shoreline, so you can go in and pick your shoreline and see where you are in your drift cell. But in this case, again, southerly wind blowing, and so it's moving the material from the right around the bay to the left. And then it settles out when it basically becomes too sheltered and the wind isn't affecting that shoreline anymore. The wind and the wind waves. So ways you can document changes on your shoreline, these things that we're talking about. So taking photos is really the easiest thing. So we recommend at a minimum in May and October. So in May, you've gone through a full winter season. And so the winter profile is showing itself basically in full form by the end of May. In October, you've gone through the whole summer. Summer is a recovery period for most of our beaches. And so you'll get the summer profile in October. But also you can do it after storms as well. It is good to have that like baseline record of like always kind of taking the same time of year. Just because it gives you, it's easier to compare from a scientific standpoint or an engineering perspective if we were to come and talk to you about your shoreline. Include something to show scale if it's available. If you don't have armoring, if you just have a bluff, you can still put a rod there, or maybe you have there's a large rock on your beach or something else that's there just as a reference point. You can measure from a fixed point to the toe or top of a bluff or backshore, depending on what kind of beach you have. This lower image is showing also just a photo of sediment. So if you notice that there's an area that the sediment type seems to change a lot, take a photo of it. It doesn't have to be a square, to put down a ruler or a yardstick to give us some scale. It helps you to document areas of erosion, document changes in your structures that might have cropped up over time. A lot of bulkheads are built with a toe on them, and you don't see the toe. You shouldn't see the toe because it was buried. That's the way that they were designed and constructed. It's part of their footing, but all of a sudden it might become exposed. And you're like, wow, so erosion could have been happening, but you just didn't jump to your mind until you saw the toe of the structure, for example. But if you've been taking photos, it might be easier to see that. Also taking photos along shore can help to document vegetation, the extent of wood on your property, the changes in the sediment gradation seasonally. If you live on a steep slope and you're concerned about the movement of the crest of that slope, you could put a stake in the ground and then just measure from that stake out to some safe location that you feel like you can get to, or lay a yardstick or something down. And just, repeatedly measure it and see if it's really changing and how quickly is it changing. And I should say, these changes, we have these sort of annualized rates that we often talk about. We say in the Greater Salish Sea that bluffs are moving on average, most of them 1 to 2 inches per year. But it doesn't happen like that, which I'm sure all of you are aware of being shoreline property owners, right? 1 year you'll have a big event, and then it's usually 3 to 5 years. Every 3 to 5 years, we see some big event that affects a particular property owner. So you might see a foot of change 1 year and nothing for 5 years. So just another question to the crowd. So how many of you think that sea level rise and climate change are having an effect on your shoreline that you've observed? Okay, great. So I've been talking a little bit about hard shoreline armoring, in case you don't really know what that means. I like to say the engineers did the best that they could with the information they had at the time. A little bit defensive of my profession, those that came before me. They didn't know better necessarily. They were installed as ways to stop erosion. At least that was the plan, that was the thought. Or like a retaining wall to kind of hold the upland in place. But unfortunately, they've had unintended consequences. In a lot of cases, they've exacerbated the erosion. So that's some of what we're dealing with now, but they come in lots of shapes and sizes because we have a lot of self-taught engineers in Puget Sound in the Salem Sea. So they can be easily installed timber walls. They can be rock. Some of it is rock that was just found on the beach, right? We have lots of large rocks on our beach that could be collected and, you know, created into these revetments. This one down below is on Lopez and that's thought to be, it was like the end of a road or the edge of a road or something. And a lot of, you know, just large material was dumped there in a very unorganized way. Still armoring, not really what I would consider a structure, just because it's not like an engineered, like built structure, but still armors the shoreline. And, you know, armoring is necessary in some places. This is not to say that like everyone, you know, should go in and remove all of their armoring. There's lots of homes, lots of ports, lots of places that we have to have some kind of stabilization of our shoreline. But just to be more aware that it does have consequences, and what are other things maybe we can think to soften that or to try to mitigate for some of those effects that it has. It's really what we want to talk about. So Tracy mentioned, so the vertical structures in particular, so not so much the large rock, but like vertical cement walls, vertical timber walls, they tend to reflect waves. So if you're in even a reasonably moderate wind wave climate, you'll see some of that scour of the beach, particularly finer sediments tend to scour out first. The beach gets coarser, so the substrate's no longer suitable for the forage fish spawning that we were talking about, but it's also eventually, you know, going to scour down to the bottom of the structure at some point. So this is an example of a beach it's the same structure on the upper photo and the lower photo, and significant erosion of that structure, exposing that toe that I mentioned, and then a lot of other concrete rubble below it. Some of the other challenges with a lot of the structures that are built in Puget Sound is they don't have drainage through them. So all water wants to make its way to Puget Sound. And so if you have a vertical concrete wall without drains in it, then that water can't get through. It's got to find a way through somehow. So it tends to go down and under. It's also a challenge for those drainage holes because you don't want the tides going in, but they can be angled so that doesn't happen. But you do need to have appropriate drainage in the structures as well. The rock revetments are easier from that perspective because they allow water to pass through them. And designed properly, they shouldn't be allowing a lot of tidal water to go in, but so armoring on Peterbilt. So here's some more of our homemade armoring. Tires. We really don't like these because they end up on the beach because they don't last. But armoring at the toe of a bluff is rarely going to do anything to stabilize the bluff. So geotechnical engineers are generally the ones you call when you have a steep slope and you have a challenge, and they're the people that have been in Puget Sound for a long time. Geotechnical engineers look at things from the landward side down, and their job is to stabilize a slope. Like that is literally the definition of what geotechnical engineers do. Not necessarily to let it erode, right? I come at things from the beach up, and so it's very uncommon. The only time that armoring at the toe slope really can make any kind of difference is if you have what we call wave cut toe erosion. And that means that literally you've got waves eating away at the toe of the bank at a rate that's so fast that the bank becomes over steepened and it has to fall in order to get back to a gentle angle. It's very, very uncommon in Puget Sound because in general, our waves are actually pretty small. Like when you think about the open coast, right? I mean, we got big waves in the open coast. Puget Sound, generally our waves are actually pretty small. So there are usually other forces that are more significant, not that wind waves don't contribute at all, but usually there's other upland forces that are more significant, like drainage, so, or surface water runoff. When it comes across the surface and if it penetrates down and it hits a contact in the geology that it can't penetrate through, so like a clay layer, then it will come out the face of the bluff. Those types of slopes are more susceptible to movement and instabilities than something that's like all sand, for example. Lack of vegetation is another one. So we removed a lot of the vegetation from the top of our steep slopes. Tracy's going to talk more about how vegetation uptakes water and why that's a challenge. But also having these kinds of structures, as I mentioned, it limits the sediment supply. And the feeder bluffs are literally, as they sound, they feed the beaches, right? They're the ones that really provide the largest volumes of sediment. Armoring doesn't really prevent landslides, so those upland forces, you know, and it will literally can just push, you know, a rock revetment forward. I mean, it has that kind of power. And Tracy also mentioned, you know, the armoring at the toe of bluff, right? It doesn't do anything for anything above that either. So they make me nervous at the toe slopes because I feel like they're a false sense of security for property owners. So Tracy mentioned, you know, armoring doesn't prevent flooding. So you can get water through, around, right? I mean, these aren't levees, right? That's what we put up in long, you know, big rivers, right? To prevent flooding is levees, but they're like long, continuous stretches of elevated structures. We don't have that, nor can we do that because, as I say, all the water from all the upland needs to make its way to Puget Sound in some way or another. So we need to be able to allow for that. So they really are not flood protection structures. There's been a little bit of work looking at different practices on the shoreline, hard armoring, soft armoring, armor removal, moving homes back, and the costs and benefits of that. And in general, the long-term benefits, you know, can make it worth it to invest a little bit more upfront in some actions. So as an example, the one that we did in Island County, we were able to show that the land value for a parcel, series of parcels on a high bank property, if they had more setback to the home, and this isn't including the home value, it's just the land value, but the larger the setback to the home, the higher value of that particular land. On a low bank site, we were able to show that low bank without the armor, so with just a natural beach and wood and vegetation where you could just walk out into the beach and you didn't have to climb over something, also had a higher value than properties that actually had a structure on them. The medium bank properties are one of the challenges. They're just somewhere in the middle and the data doesn't really fall out very cleanly one way or another. I think it's in part because the strategies on medium banks are just they're very, very site specific because they vary so much. They're just that intermediary category. Friends San Juans also did a couple of case studies with similar kind of findings. It has some interesting information just looking at the relative costs of moving a home, armoring, soft shore. So how expensive is one compared to another? I mentioned shoreline permitting. So most work, almost all work, vegetation, drainage, structure. So even like sort of small amounts of work within 200 feet of the shoreline or that ordinary high water mark requires permits. County, state, and or federal permits may be required. This organization, Shore Friendly, is non-regulatory. We are non-regulatory. We're just here to just make you aware of this. Start with the county for guidance if you think you need to get a permit, and they can help you understand what other permits might be required. And Friends of San Juans has a stewardship guide with a list of resources that can also help with that. So hard armor removal. So sometimes it's possible. And these are the sort of opportunities that we're often looking for. Where can we help landowners? Because it's not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of uncertainty. So the technical site visits can look at the feasibility of armor removal for you.
And so essentially removing structures and adding, usually we often add beach nourishment sediment, basically. Because your beach might have been a little bit starved of material by having a structure there for a number of years. Plantings, sometimes we bring in driftwood depending on the site. One of the biggest challenges is addressing neighboring bulkheads. So if it's, continuous bulkheads, along a stretch, removing a single one can be challenging, may not work, may not be appropriate. So that's something that we really look very closely at. Try to talk to your neighbors if that's possible and see, if there's more opportunity, if it's the right site to be able to do that. So this is the soft shoreline that I mentioned. It doesn't have to, you don't actually have to install new things. It really, again, very site specific, depends on how heavily altered it is. I've seen some sites where they just have like concrete slabs that maybe were vertical at one time, but they've just fallen down and they're on the beach, and we'd love to get those out, right? Super easy. It's just smothering the intertidal environment. This is a project that Friends did that Catherine's going to talk a little bit about, where the home was well set back or just not in this particular area. And there was a timber wall that they were able to remove and lots of fill and uncover what was a beach before. So that's often what we do too, is we go back in the historical photographs and look for indicators of what did it look like before? What are the possibilities? What might it have been or could be? Again, if appropriate. I just like to mention that rafting of large wood together is not, this has been misinterpreted a few places that we work as being soft shore protection, and it's not. We like the driftwood to be able to move around. For one thing, you probably observed, so driftwood, when it floats during extreme water level events, right, it's ramming into the bank, and you can actually, it can actually cause and initiate some erosion. So if you have these big pieces all strapped together, it's just a larger battering ram because it's still gonna float. But also they don't tend to last, and then it just becomes debris, in the water column. We don't anchor wood on shorelines like with buried anchors and chains. That was done a little bit like 15 years ago, but it essentially creates scour around it. And that's the last thing we want to do, is to create scour holes. It's actually used in rivers to create a hole of remove the material and create circulation patterns so that fish have a nice cool pool to live in. So we kind of took that and it translated and said, oh, we could just, add wood out on the shorelines too and anchor. We should anchor it in place. And it had some negative consequences in places where that was done. Manage retreat is the last thing that I'm just going to mention. So it's a hard conversation, just like it is with roads, right? Moving major roads and having to fundamentally change land use. But as things continue to change, as the bluff crest gets to be closer to homes, it's something that we want people just to start thinking about, to consider as a long-term planning. It can be more cost-effective than some other solutions. But the important thing is you have to do it before it becomes an emergency situation. So this home sitting on top of that bluff is not eligible to be moved anymore, because you need to be able to get to all four sides of that to be able to, like, basically they put it up on these rollers and roll it onto a large, sometimes they're moved by barge. If you're moving them, from island to island, you're just moving them on a property, literally putting it up on rollers and moving it. And they have to do things like move all the utilities, right? Create a new foundation. And so depending on the home, in the age of the home, it's easier or harder for properties to be able to do that. But sometimes we just see really small structures that are close to the shoreline that people want to preserve, and those are pretty easy to move.
You know how long ago that was built?
This home, I don't know specifically with this home. We're gonna ask, in case I didn't say, we're gonna ask you to hold questions to the end. But that's an easy one. I don't know how long ago that particular home was built. This is on Whidbey Island. I do know that, and Whidbey Island has some steep slopes and bluffs that they experience what we call deep-seated landslides, which means they're losing like 10 feet of material in any given event. So those are like, if you're, it's something that when you go to buy a home on a steep slope, I do recommend you get a geotechnical engineer to look at your slope stability and just ask the question of,
Do you think this is a stable slope or is it not a stable slope based on the surrounding geology? And they can give you that question. Has it had historic landslides in the past close by that were big? They can also give you that information too. I don't know what year that house was. Okay. All right, so how many of you have armoring on your shoreline of some kind? Okay, great. Well, then you'll be more interested in what Tracy has to say.
All right, so we're almost done here, so I'm just gonna touch on drainage stuff and vegetation, which are two of the easiest, or I should say they're the most tangible things for owners to do something about on their property. So we've talked a lot about how water can cause instability on the shoreline. So there's lots of different sources of water on the shoreline. So you can have runoff from the pavement that isn't making it into like a storm system and being discharged somewhere. You can have runoff from your roof that isn't being controlled and it's just flowing off directly like onto the ground. Septic drainage adds water to the slopes. Rain, obviously something we cannot control, although we'd like to sometimes, but we can control irrigation if you're adding additional water to your property. Remove trees isn't directly adding water to the property, but it's getting rid of, if you don't have trees, you're getting rid of a way for that water to come out of your slope. And I'm going to talk more about that in the vegetation section. And that increased saturation in the soils increases the risk of either just superficial sloughing as well as the deep-seated landslides like Jessica was talking about, where the water is going through the different geologic layers. And if it hits an impervious layer, so something that the water can't go through, it makes a slippery surface on that geologic layer. And then you can have slow sliding or large mass failures like Jessica was talking about, all dependent on the geology in there. So you can look on your property for different things that maybe or can point out that there might be a concern related to your drainage on your property. So some drainage systems have like a clean out or whatever. And so you would be able to visually see that that's clogged with debris or other sediments. If you see pools of standing water in your lawn, that means that your underground is saturated and it doesn't have the ability to hold any more water. So the water is literally pooling on the surface. If you're irrigating frequently, that's adding additional water that may be too much for the underlying geology to safely handle. And you can see flowing surface erosion off the top of your bluffs or banks. Something that's hard to control is if you're getting runoff from upland properties. Like Jessica mentioned, all water from the upland is making its way. It's going from the highest elevation to the lowest elevation, which is Puget Sound. So it needs to make its way to Puget Sound somehow, some way. And then if you have like surface roof drains on your property, that usually those are collected and then put into a pipe that goes underground. And if you're not checking that and you don't know if it's working, you may have cracked or damaged pipes underneath the ground that are then just directly discharging water to the underlying soil. And you may see seepage visible on the exposed bluff face, and that's just showing that the water is moving through. And if you have a really clear line of water that's coming out on the bluff, that could actually be an indication of that impervious layer. So the water gets to a certain point and is sliding out through the bluff. On shorelines, we generally suggest not doing the one on the left where water is collected into a drain pipe and then is being discharged partway down, because that's just adding water directly to that area on the bluff. And I've seen many examples of where there's a pipe like that and there's a tree that's like fallen. So it's loosened that soil around that vegetation and allowed it to fall down. So we generally suggest something more like to the right, where you have preferably a high HDPE pipe, so it's like the firmer plastic pipe. It's discharging all the way down to the toe of the bluff in something called a T diffuser. So just a T-shaped pipe that has holes in it, so it's allowing that water to be discharged more diffusely than just a, you know, a fire hose essentially at the bottom of the slope. This is an example where it's being discharged a little bit higher up, and it's also in a more concentrated discharge. And so you can see that surface erosion, the rivulets that are happening in the sediment there. So I'll finish talking about marine riparian vegetation. So that vegetation along the water's edge, it can look really different depending on where you are, what aspects, so what direction you're facing. Do you get morning sun, afternoon sun? No, you know, is it really shaded? All those sorts of things. Is there a lot of invasive vegetation? That upper right photo is primarily English ivy and blackberry. And it's really hard to see the bluff, and where we're going for the beach walk has a really good example of why that can be an issue. But vegetation is the easiest thing for property owners to do something about, the thing that requires the less cumbersome in terms of permitting. It's great habitat, and vegetation makes your property look nice. So some ways that it helps on the property is the leaves on all the vegetation disperse the rainfall, so you're not getting more direct rainfall right onto the sediment surface and having surface erosion. Temporary battery running low situation. Hey, my battery is running low too.
Can I hit close on that? So that's-
You can, I think, so we can keep going, sure.
I don't.
And roots uptake water and then release that water to the atmosphere, and that's called evapotranspiration. And we had a great question yesterday that I couldn't remember. Like, I'm sure at one point I knew from one of my college rainforest ecology courses how much water like a mature tree could release to the atmosphere every day. A Douglas fir releases 50 to 100 gallons of water to the atmosphere every day. Now that doesn't mean that there's exactly that much like in the ground that it would be taking up, because the tree is made of, it's like us, it's made of like 90% water, but it is like, it's using water. It is uptaking water and releasing it to the atmosphere every day. I thought I was struck by that number. And roots are proportional to the size of the plant. So a tree has more roots than a shrub, has more roots than, you know, ground cover like a strawberry or something like that. But all of those different types of plants play an important role, because like grasses and ground covers can trap that superficial sediment. And shrubs can tie, you know, the top few layers of sediment together. And then trees can really tie, not only most of our conifer trees have like a large taproot that goes down, but then it will also have roots that can extend well, like if a tree is 100 feet tall, it can have roots that extend to the sides like up to 300 feet. So a lot of roots in there. And there's good examples where we're gonna do the beach walk of where those roots are tying the sediment together, because it has started to erode. You can see the roots, but it's still, the trees are still vertical, they're still alive, they're still holding that bluff in place. And vegetation on the shoreline provides shade and habitat for species. So, you know, anybody who lives on the shoreline, if you have a conifer on your property, you've probably seen an eagle in there. If you haven't seen an eagle, you've seen some other sort of shorebird using that tree as habitat. And then the trees are also, and other vegetation is also providing shade to that nearshore environment. So when the forage fish spawn, if they have a nice cool area where their eggs are laid, then those eggs have a higher chance for survival to be able to live to be hatched. If you do have vegetation on your property, we suggest that even if it's something you don't want and you would like to change it, keep it, and then in small areas, like work through it. So don't just like rip out everything you've got, because then you're gonna have this exposed sediment that can be eroded more easily. So take it in chunks where you can manage to change it as you wish as you go. And particularly to not expose soil like in the wet times of the year when you're gonna have more water in the ground, more water on the surface causing more erosion. I touched on invasive species in general. I mean, they usually don't look very pretty. Some people, like the Scotch broom in the upper right, people have allergies to it. Like in general, we don't like them. And they're invasive because they take over. They take over everything and they become a monoculture. It's the only thing that's there. And English ivy, I mentioned that one. There's examples on the beach walk where that can, I've seen so many examples where that's like growing over the bluff and it looks like you're like, oh, I've got a really vegetated bluff. This is great. But if you part that ivy curtain, the actual bluff face is 5, 10, 15 feet back. So it makes you think that's where the bluff is at, but it's actually eroding behind that curtain of ivy and you just can't see behind there. So if you want to try and remove invasives from your property, there's a few different, there's lots of different methods, but again, start with small areas and try and get one area under control before you move to the next area. As much as possible, you want to try and do it by hand because disturbance of the soil encourages it to grow and spread. You may need to use herbicides to be really effective, particularly if you have a really bad infestation. And state and county noxious weed board, as well as the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has really great like 1 to 2 page flyers that are super specific to each type of noxious weed and the best ways to remove and eradicate it. I mentioned sheet mulching yesterday, and somebody said they were a master gardener or went to a master gardener class with WSU and actually suggested that this is maybe switching, that this isn't suggested, but what sheet mulching is essentially putting down cardboard or some other sort of barrier like landscape fabric, which that's not been suggested for a while, but then covering it with mulch. But I guess some cardboard, because it's hard to tell if there's chemicals in the cardboard, may not actually be a great thing. And I was doing some research at 4 o'clock this morning, and it does seem like that is something. So I'm going to kind of skip that, but you can temporarily put down like black plastic or clear plastic after you've removed the vegetation. Like in a couple of weeks, you will probably have like started to at least kill off whatever was there that you don't want there anymore. And then you remove that plastic and then plant something new, and you could put mulch on top of it. There's not an issue with the mulch with sheet mulching. It's more an issue with the cardboard and not knowing what exactly is in the cardboard. Mowing is also something you can do, but it's important to note that most, if not like most invasive species, just a small little clipping is something that can re-sprout. So mowing is not commonly used for a lot of them, but with reed canary grass, which can be common in more freshwater, like drainage ditches and stuff like that, mowing can be used. And so disposal, because they can sprout from little pieces that are left over, it's usually something where you want to burn it, put it in commercial compost, or just throw it straight in the garbage, because otherwise you may just be spreading it all over your property. And unfortunately, invasive species take a lot of persistence to get rid of. So we always recommend to use native plants when you can, primarily because native plants are used to our climate. They're used to a wet, soggy winter and a relatively dry summer. And so once they're established in the ground, you don't need to water them anymore. And there's lots of ways you can get native plants. And in that key points handout that Jessica mentioned at the start, we have a list of different resources for where you can get them. The conservation districts usually do a spring sale with native plants. And if you're like, I'm not sure what sort of native plant I want, again, nurseries that have a good native plant selection, as well as those conservation district sales, they can give you ideas, but you may be able to install an app on your phone, take a picture of a plant and see if it's native. And because the things that are gonna work well on your property are the things that are already growing there, and you can always try new stuff too. But if it's already growing there, more of it will also grow there. Planting during the wet season, so like in the fall or early enough in the spring that we're still getting rain, so like now is a great time for planting. And today would be a great day to go out and work in your garden. Because I'm sure we'll get more rain after this sunny weather. And there's some cheaper ways that you can go about getting plants. So there's something called bare roots, where it's just like it sounds. It's a little plant that has little naked roots, or they might be called plugs. And you can get them much cheaper than you think if you go and get like a Douglas fir tree at a nursery in like a 5-gallon bucket. That's a pretty expensive purchase, but you could get bare root Douglas fir much cheaper. And then there's also a lot of plants like snowberry, willow, red osier dogwood are all ones that can grow from stakes. So it's literally like a stick that you can put in the ground. You can purchase those stakes, but if you have those plants on your property, you can Google and figure out how to create your own live stakes too. It's pretty easy actually. And plant a variety, see what works. Like I said, look for species that are already established nearby that you like how they look, try them. And with trees, definitely suggest using a professional, maybe getting a couple different quotes. Something that's pretty common on the shoreline is topping the tree. So just literally cutting the top off the tree so you can have a nice view. But I mentioned, you know, mature Douglas fir is getting rid of 50 to 100 gallons of water a day to the atmosphere. And the way it's doing that is through this cambium layer that's under its bark. So it's bringing the water up through that cambium, bringing it up to the leaves. That's where it does the photosynthesis and it's releasing water to the atmosphere. So when you cut the tree off, if there's any sort of fungus or other, you know, weevils or anything that can get into the tree, you're giving it like a pathway to its circulatory system. So it's not great for the trees to top it. And there's lots of other ways to do pruning. So you can still maintain a nice view corridor, but you're maintaining the health of the tree. And then planting younger trees to establish succession, where we're doing the beach walk. There's a good example of like where there's trees on the shoreline, but there's no, you know, smaller trees beneath it. So once those trees eventually fall down, if nothing is planted to become the next generation, then it's just going to be an exposed, empty top of bluff there. And those are resources that are in that key points handout. So there's lots of different beautiful native plants. These are just an example of some of them. And with that, I think we're gonna do questions, yeah?
Great, thanks, Daisy, thanks, Jessica. We'll take a couple of people have questions, you can ask really specific questions or general questions. Go ahead, right now.
You mentioned what I have always attributed our erosion, but only vaguely. We have a lot of logs that come in. We do have a long stretch, and it's always going to be. Do logs really not? Am I under the wrong impression that they don't? I see the erosion on it. You can't get rid of logs.
Right, I mean, so the logs are actually great stabilizers of the sediment when they settle down, when they're not floating around, you know, they do actually allow sediment to accumulate behind them, that sediment that comes off the bank, right? You can imagine when there's logs on the beach, then it settles in behind as opposed to moving further down the beach. They also degrade and provide a lot of nutrients. And plants tend to establish in them too. So yes, but the moving of the logs and the hitting of the bank, it's not that it can, and we see them most of the time. The concerns of the logs are when people have staircases. And so then the logs are hitting the staircases and damaging the staircases. And so one thing that we really have talked a lot about, and I have some photos we don't have here, but is thinking about retractable staircases. I've seen them both as wood and as aluminum. So where you have a platform that's a little bit higher up. If you do aluminum, the nice thing is it can be light penetrating, it can have grading, and they have very thin
very small diameter pilings that you can put it on because they're pretty light. It's, not susceptible to, degradation from the salt water as well. And so the lower, 5, 6 stairs, whatever it is, can actually be on a hand winch that you can just, lift up and get out of the intertidal zone in the wintertime. So then you don't have to be constantly repairing them. So a little bit of an investment up front, but they last much, much longer. You can also get the plants will establish underneath them. And we're always going down to repair our stairs, right? You're gonna be on the bank probably, and so you're just sort of disturbing that bank too. So anything we can do to make them longer lasting can be really useful. Or we've also talked about if there's like a collection of neighbors and you can do like community access or shared staircases just to reduce the number. But in terms of the log specifically, damaging staircases, I haven't really seen any instances where I felt like it was just the logs, right, creating the problem because they're mixed in with the wind waves. So there's all these other forces, going on at the same time. So
There's one thing I wanted to comment about on, at least on Orcas, there is, the county provides someone to come out and actually deal with them out.
oh, great.
So you can get them to come out and get rid of it.
Perfect. Nice to know. Yeah.
Literally went down because their office is in here. So we've got some of the non-food lists of the contact info, so she's a big fan of stuff. Yeah, we can pass them around and look and pick them on our way out.
Other questions? Yeah.
You described our property perfectly. We got sand and silt on top of a layer of clay at about a 45-degree angle. And we have huge landslides. And now I can see a spring. So we've got 2 springs there. Is there any way you can trace a spring to intercept it before it gets to the steep bank?
We have seen some properties that have tried to do that. It's not impossible. I will say it can be challenging. So we've seen some folks who have, some were old like water wells, and then we moved to municipal water. And so the water wells were actually collecting a lot of the water and they weren't having as many problems. They moved to municipal water, the wells filled up, they spilled over, and then all of a sudden there's water in the bank again, right? So then they put in sump pumps to actually pump the water, but you still have to pump the water somewhere. And in that case, they're usually pumping it into a pipe that's discharging at the bottom at the toe of the slope as well. Hydrogeology, hydrogeology is the study of groundwater flow. I don't know, are there any local hydrogeologists, Tina, that you're aware of?
I think it's the folks from, they used to be Pacific Groundwater, but they have their contacts and they have.
Okay.
They work for the Juans, so they do a lot of studying.
Okay.
They did get bought up, so you see a nice little rental shop and now are with that.
Yeah.
So,
A lot of geotechnical engineering firms will also have hydrogeologists, and so they're really the ones that have to be able to trace that. So sometimes you can do things, again, like French drains to deter it from a certain location, but you're not going to be able to do what's called infiltrating, right? I mean, that's essentially the problem. We like groundwater to be able to infiltrate down through the ground. It gets nice and clean that way. But when you have those clay layers, it gets stuck at that clay layer and then it creates a hazard. And so it's probably going to be something where it's, like I said, some kind of system that's collecting it with maybe a pump to a pipe that's going to go over. So that's kind of the option. But yeah, we didn't connect with, take one of Tina's cards and she and I can talk a little bit more and see if we can, who would be the best person to help you.
Yeah, and I was just gonna add to that, obviously, it doesn't hurt to have somebody come out and look too, but when you think about all those things that Jessica just mentioned, all that's infrastructure that you would then be putting on your property potentially. So you just have to have that in mind, that has to be maintained, right? To have it be functional and doing any help. And one thing I mentioned in one of the other which would be, if you had a geotech and or hydrogeo come out, is that there is a procedure if you happen to have bedrock within a reasonable area, you can pin structures to underlying bedrock. So you're at least helping stabilize your structure from shifting and sliding, even though you may continue to have erosion, but that would still be contacting a geotech person to come out and look at that sort of stuff.
So I have it's a stable rocky water thing, so I don't have an issue with that. But I have surface water that comes down. And so I've taken my 4-inch flexi pipes, and got those drains. So I've got it going down towards the outside of my properties. And my question is, when I release it, let's say 50 feet, 75 feet from the water, would it be good to have something that I saw you had that little T shape thing. But is there something that could provide a little filtration? I didn't run it right into the water just because I thought it's natural filtration of letting it flow down.
Sure.
Is that a good idea, bad idea? What's ideal?
That's a great question. And so you don't have a pocket beach or anything on it. You don't
No,
really
it's
have
just
any
rocky.
soft sediment at all. You have all rocks. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you can, so if you were to put in a tea diffuser, for example, or even in the upland, so one thing you can do is if you have a catchment basin, you can provide some kind of filter fabric or there's other like some other kind of water treatment type of system you can put into the.
You mean, are you trying to like rain garden or would?
No, because rain gardens are trying to infiltrate down. You
Yeah.
can do things like, they're called stilling wells, right? So if you have a catchment in the upland that you're collecting the water in before you're discharging it, you can put like a lot of rock in there, for example, and that just helps to just sort of soften the water. Maybe some of the contaminants might fall out, maybe they won't. I mean, it's more for debris and turbidity and things like that so that they don't discharge. I don't know that it would really help to like clean the water necessarily. I mean, if it's roof runoff, it's usually not terrible. We worry more about road runoff, and as there's been a lot of studies showed about the rubber from tires from road runoff is actually a pretty strong contaminant and is a major issue in terms of salmon species. So if it's just roof runoff, then you probably don't necessarily need to filter it or to, to try to do something else. The tea diffuser isn't really gonna filter it unless you put, like I said, some kind of filter fabric or something, some kind of screening, sand screenings or other ways that water is sort of cleaned and treated. So that would require, again, if you have a cistern or a catchment basin, you could fill it with sand so that the water was kind of filtering through that sand, and then it got to some height and it would overflow and go out.
Yeah.
So trickier, but
Yeah, oh, I was just gonna add that, so it sounded like you were trying to slow it down before infiltrating it, because you're not worried about like erosion and stuff, which is great. A really small amount of vegetative buffer can have like a huge impact on water quality. And even though like we were mentioning like contaminants that it might be able to filter out, a contaminant really to Puget Sound is also excess nitrogen and phosphorus, which are in fertilizers that we like to put on our lawn. But when they enter the Puget Sound, they can cause something called eutrophication, which you might have heard of in like South Hood Canal, where they don't get enough flushing and stuff. It causes the algae and and plankton to bloom so much, it uptakes all the oxygen in the water and then it kills off fish. So it's like not just about like the tire and the brake stuff is really important, but also just like the fertilizers and stuff that people are using, whether it's you or your neighbors or, just on the landscape level too. Just putting in a pitch for vegetation.
so it's kind of long to say may or may not need to do anything, I guess.
Let's see, one more question now, and just for a little context set for folks, Catherine's gonna end with talking for just a couple minutes about the different resources and programs we have for property owners. And we'll take a little break where folks can ask more questions of us, and then we'll move to the subject side. So let's do this one more question in the front.
House with sea setting very close to the water. So it's pretty different. And we have a lot of problems with both on the deck, on the house, with basically lots of, I guess it's some, and very hesitant to use anything to right to step out, because it's against it. Then it's with products.
I don't have much of any suggestions for products. I will say, I mean, I also don't know how like detrimental it is. I mean, I see some houses with some pretty significant moss. You can obviously physically remove it
It's
too.
actually- it's permanent. It's
Oh,
like sort of a black.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Buildings.
Yep, yeah,
And there's also the slippery stuff on the deck.
yeah,
I mean,
which
it is-
that's a hazard, yeah,
Right.
for sure, for sure.
I found conservation district, I don't know if there's anybody, friends that would have information about that, but conservation districts generally are super incredibly knowledgeable about different vegetation, but also that kind of, you know.
Yeah,
those kind of
there are some
products
lists
too.
and guidelines for that. We are, just as a note, we're gonna do a follow-up email to everyone who registered, so if you didn't register before you can, that's fine, maybe the biggest email, follow-up. That will have that pinpoint handout, you'll notice in the hyperlinks, we have versions, so we can just click right on those. And we can make a note to think about, there are definitely some product suggestions, for households, households every large,
Okay, Catherine's gonna bring us on home.
For the deck, pressure washer,
Yeah.
Yeah.
a little work.
Yeah. You do. It does, yeah.
Yes.
Depends on what the deck is. It's hard enough material. It's like-
Yeah, so I'll just wrap things up for us before we head out to the beach. So like was prefaced, we've got a lot of different resources available through Friends of the San Juans. And just to reiterate what's been talked about today, we have really dynamic coastlines here in the San Juans that serve a lot of important functions for our marine ecosystems, as well as for us as humans and the legacies that we're a part of. So, this is our great marine food web, and just to really drive that point home, we are a part of it. Everything we do on land does in fact affect the marine ecosystem. So part of the programs that we offer are site visits. These are free, and they are either private, or you can do a neighborhood-wide beach walk, site visit if you'd like, and have neighbors that are interested. It is about 45 to 60 minutes long. It's typically myself and a coastal geologist that come out, and we'll take a look around at your parcel, and you can ask us any questions that you might have. We'll get down in the ground, checking things out for you, and think together on different solutions to some issues that you may have. And then from that site visit, you get a custom-made map set. This is, these are maps that show you basically a great overlook of what's going on around your parcel. It shows nearshore environments like eelgrass beds and bull kelp forests, as well as the geomorphic shore forms, what kind of shoreline you're on, what the geology might be doing in that area. Also fish use of that area as well, and then flood hazards and inundation. So we also provide a post-site visit memo. So this is just a big, long description summarizing what we've talked about with you and giving you some next steps that you can refer back to. And that will also include lots of resources on erosion, vegetation, drainage, and anything else that we discussed on your visit. Another thing we offer is a cost share program for vegetation. So like Tracy was so nicely saying, vegetation is a super effective way to kind of immediately benefit your shoreline. And we have ways that we can help you with that. And then we also do feasibility and design of restoration projects. And just as a quick shout out, this Broken Point restoration project that we did is very dramatic looking. It was a big project that we were a part of. We just completed it last Monday. It was very exciting. This bulkhead wall was put in the fifties and was failing. And there was no house behind. It was just a yard and a garden, and the house was farther back on an area that was unaffected. So we helped nourish the beach, reveal a beach that had been filled on top of, and now we have another beach that can provide suitable forage fish spawn habitat in the future. And then on the right, this project was done over on San Juan Island. And this big shelf there was being mowed all the way to the edge, as you can see the grass going there. So we revegetated that whole area with some different plants, some native plants, and helped to kind of stabilize the slope from the top there. Anything to add, Tina, on that?
Yeah, I would just give an example. This is just an example, and in the vast majority of cases where we do site visits, right, there is a restoration project that comes out of it. We've done probably 400 site visits and we implement. So, but it's giving folks a sort of the view of, you know, if there is an old weird structure, we've taken out a scuffleboard core, we've taken out old concrete patios that are all broken up all over the beach, right? If they're not serving any purpose, they're like and falling down, slopes and things that people aren't using anymore. But again, in the vast majority of cases, it's really the site visits are giving you information that will help you think about a long-term management of your site. And in the vast majority of cases, you come for that hour with whatever experts, sometimes you bring an arborist, sometimes you bring a coastal geologist, you know, get the report afterwards, right? And what is the underlying geology? What are the classes that play on your site? And if there were any recommendations, what are those? And again, there sometimes are great restoration opportunities, and so that's to include those because we can help you through all steps. We can help you with the feasibility and the design and the engineering, and we don't go into these lightly, but these projects have a lot of engineering and a lot of assessment done before the projects are implemented. And we can also help with funding and fundraising and help them like from the beginning, from the concept stage, all the way through permitting and stuff. So we just want to give you sort of a teaser of that, because it is how we find a lot of our restoration sites, but the vast majority again, the site visits are more along. We focus a lot on drainage and vegetation today. That's if we've done hundreds of site visits, and drainage and vegetation is the main things that we are manipulating, right? And they're also doing things in easier, low cost things that we have to.
So, thank you. Yeah, so we have a web page on our website that's devoted just to site visits and this information that you've heard about today. You can go ahead to our Shore Friendly Living webpage with that URL there. And there's also in your packets, there's a postcard that has a QR code on it, and you can also use the QR code and get right to there. That's just by hovering your phone over it with your camera, and it'll drop you right into that web page. And you'll also get contact information if you have any questions. Friends of the San Juans is a resource. We are the leads of the Shore Friendly program here in San Juan County. So are very happy to answer any questions you may have, whether that's on a site visit or over the phone. So don't hesitate to reach out to us as well. I just want to say thank you so much again for hanging out for this indoor portion. I also want to give a quick shout out to Kim Secunda. Thank you so much for your volunteering today. And thank you so much to Blue Coast Engineering and Northwest Straits Foundation for being here.